Welcome to Night World. The Nevada sun was a cruel, relentless furnace, beating down on the cracked asphalt that led to the abandoned Fort Morrow Military Hospital. For Mark Sullivan, the heat was a necessary evil, a physical discomfort easily ignored in the pursuit of the perfect photograph. Mark was a freelance photographer drawn not to beauty, but to decay, the grim, honest architecture of ruin. He specialized in industrial blight, finding a strange, melancholic dignity in structures where human purpose had faded and the elements had taken over. Fort Morrow, a sprawling, anonymous complex of low-slung concrete and rusted steel in the middle of the desert, was rumored to be the crown jewel of American decay. Shut down mysteriously in the late 1980s, and perfectly preserved by the arid climate, he had spent weeks obtaining the necessary, highly dubious permits to bypass the razor wire and the crumbling perimeter fence. Stepping over the threshold of the main, administrative building was like walking into a freezer. The interior air was unnaturally cold, still holding the last breath of the forced ventilation system that had sealed the place off decades ago. The silence was immense, broken only by the crunch of fine desert dust under his heavy combat boots. His camera bag felt heavy, loaded with expensive gear, yet he felt a familiar, thrilling lightness of being here, an escape from the trivial noise of the living world. The hospital, however, held a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a place designed to contain screams, where walls were built not just for shelter, but for absolute, unforgiving confinement, and the air seemed too thick to carry anything but memory. The corridors were long, uniform, and depressing, lined with peeling mint green paint that spoke of antiseptic terror rather than healing. And the only light came from the occasional broken pane of glass, letting in harsh, accusing shafts of sunlight that illuminated the swirling dust and the endless, depressing repetition of doors. Mark spent the first few hours in the general wards, documenting the expected decay, overturned gurneys, faded floral curtains hanging in shreds, and the unsettling symmetry of empty metal beds. It was sterile, boring decay, the kind that makes for predictable, low-stakes photography. But his intuition, the freelance photographer's subtle sense for narrative, told him the story was deeper. He noticed an unusual lack of graffiti or vandalism. The hospital felt sealed, almost waiting. He came across a large, unmarked steel door at the end of a long, otherwise unused basement corridor, a door painted a uniform. Chilling gray, thicker and newer than any other in the building, sealed with 3 large, industrial padlocks that looked decades old. This was not a supply closet or a utility room. This was a deliberate exclusion, a heavy, permanent silence that piqued his professional curiosity instantly. He had researched the hospital's public blueprints extensively, and this wing, the southeastern corner of the basement, was officially marked on all documents as unused storage, structural instability, a glaring lie given the rest of the building's formidable construction. He knew, with the certainty of a man who makes his living hunting secrets, that this was where the real archive of the hospital resided, the grim, unacknowledged truth hidden from public record and from time itself. Using a small, specialized hydraulic cutter he kept for difficult access, Mark breached the 3 padlocks one by one, the sound of grinding steel echoing sharply in the vast, still silence of the basement before being quickly swallowed by the oppressive air. The heavy door yielded with a slow, laborious shriek of tearing metal, and the air that rushed out was not cold or dusty, but strangely warm, heavy with a thick, acrid senna smell Mark couldn't place, something metallic and organic, like stale blood mixed with antiseptic cream and old rust, a scent that immediately seized his throat and made his eyes water. He stepped through, his flashlight beam cutting into the suffocating, absolute darkness of the sealed-off wing. The corridor here was different. Instead of the institutional mint green, the walls were coated in a dark mottled crimson, a color that looked deliberate, not painted, but almost stained, radiating a sense of compressed, furious pain. This was the hidden surgical wing, the secret archive. And the change in atmosphere was immediate and visceral. The air felt heavy, like wading through thick fluid, and the absolute silence felt alive. Concentrated and impossibly heavy, vibrating with an unseen, powerful energy. The first row he entered was clearly an operating theater, but one that seemed designed less for healing and more for detailed, controlled documentation of trauma. Instead of the typical sterile white, the room was finished in dark tile, and the large, central surgical table was made of stainless steel, pitted and scored with countless tiny, deliberate-looking incisions that looked more like minute surgical carvings than accidents. Around the room, on specialized shelving, were hundreds of small square frames, like shadow boxes. These contained not patient files, but individual pieces of biological matter preserved in thick, amber fluid fragments of scarred skin, fractured bone slivers, excised tumor cells, all meticulously labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes and pinned beneath small placards detailing not the treatment, but the source of the trauma, VA, 1978, Subject 44, Section B, acute spinal fear. Mark slowly realized the horrific nature of the head physician's obsession. He had not been treating injuries. He had been collecting and curating human pain, preserving the physical evidence of intense, sustained suffering as if it were a rare geological specimen, a grotesque museum of mortal affliction that had been sealed off and forgotten. The weight of this realization pressed down on him, making his breath shallow and his hands tremble, and he began to feel a faint, persistent itching on his own forearm, right where he had a minor scar from a childhood accident. He moved into the physician's private observation room, which overlooked the operating theater through a large one-way mirror. The walls here were not painted, but covered in thick, dark leather, and the air was subtly colder. On the large mahogany desk, Mark found the head physician's final bound journal. The physician, a Dr. Silas Thorne, detailed his chilling philosophy. He believed pain, especially trauma, was a quantifiable, storable energy, and that the body was merely the vessel. Thorne theorized that if a structure could be engineered to contain enough acute suffering, the building itself would achieve a form of malignant consciousness, constantly reliving and archiving the intense, pure energy of trauma. He wrote of using specialized, high-frequency sonic pulses during surgery to fix the pain and print directly onto the structural materials, the stone, the tile, and especially the metal. Thorne called his creation the Archive of Wounded Memory, a perpetual machine designed to contain all the suffering that passed through its doors, giving it a physical home where it would never truly dissipate, making the very walls of the structure a silent, living, breathing testament to endless human agony and terror. Mark felt the itching on his forearm intensify, turning into a sharp, localized burning sensation, exactly the feeling of the original childhood injury he had sustained 40 years ago, a sensation that lasted only a moment before disappearing, leaving him dizzy and profoundly unnerved. He had touched the walls, he had opened the sealed air, and the archive had immediately registered his presence. The journal entry continued, describing the ultimate goal, to build the entire hidden wing into a perfect pain battery, capable of not just storing the suffering of the past, but projecting it onto the present. The walls were designed not to let the pain escape, but to transmit it onto a new host, infecting them with the physical memory of every agonizing moment ever experienced within the archive. Mark slowly lowered his hand, his eyes fixed on the pitted steel of the surgical table, realizing that the innumerable incisions and microscopic carvings weren't just documentation. They were transmitters, tiny points designed to focus and broadcast the archive's enormous stored energy directly onto anyone foolish enough to intrude on the surgical theater's terrible silence. The fear was cold, absolute, and purely intellectual. The hospital was not haunted by ghosts. It was alive with concentrated, weaponized pain, stored in the very atoms of its material. He instinctively recoiled from the desk, moving backward, his breath catching in his throat as his left hand brushed the dark, leather-covered wall. The moment of contact was electric, sharp, and visceral. He felt a sudden, agonizing stabbing pain deep in his lower back, accompanied by the fleeting, horrifying image of falling from a great height. A memory that was definitively not his own, a raw, terrifying experience of broken bones and crushing impact that lingered for a dizzying second before the archive retracted the sensation. He checked his back. There was no injury, but the phantom pain was crippling, leaving him weak and nauseated. He realized with terrible certainty that he had become the archive's new patient, and that the building was performing its first diagnostic, testing the limits of its new host. His role here was not curator or documentarian. It was the next subject, the next source of pain to be surgically cataloged and absorbed into the hungry, crimson walls of the archive. The silence of the desert outside suddenly felt like a massive, waiting audience, and the profound, cold quiet of the hospital was the sound of the surgical wing preparing its instruments. Asterisk marks professionalism. The last bastion of his rational mind, dissolved into pure, desperate survival instinct. The initial panic, however, was quickly replaced by a chilling realization. The archive was not trying to scare him off. It was trying to infect him. It was a slow, deliberate assault designed to wear down his psyche before the final, full-spectrum transmission of stored pain. He moved, not frantically, but with grim, controlled haste, knowing that every moment spent within the crimson corridor was allowing the archive to read his psychological defenses and select the most crippling trauma from its vast library of human suffering. He retreated from the surgical theater, the heavy steel door groaning shut behind him. But he knew the flimsy barrier offered no real protection against the psychic, material energy that had already breached his physical defenses. He needed to understand the rules of this terrifying new architecture. The geometry of contained agony. He returned to the physician's observation room, forced to touch the leather wall one more time, bracing himself for the assault. This time, the archive delivered a quick, searing jolt of emotional betrayal and abandonment, a sharp, sickening twist in his stomach that made him physically double over, a pain more profound and scarring than any broken bone, a trauma that clearly belonged to a discarded spouse or a disillusioned friend. The pain faded instantly, leaving behind a cold, detached residue of resentment that was frighteningly hard to shake off. Mark quickly scanned the walls and ceiling, using the infrared lens of his camera. The infrared light, which usually revealed heat variations, instead highlighted complex, shimmering patterns in the crimson walls, subtle geometric distortions that pulsed with a faint, non-thermal light, confirming Dr. Thorne's chilling theory of sonic imprinting. The walls were indeed the archives, and they were actively radiating, broadcasting their stored misery into the immediate vicinity. The air was thick with latent pain, and his every breath was drawing him deeper into the building's permanent, corrosive agony. He forced himself to focus on Dr. Thorne's journal, flipping frantically past the surgical notes and diagrams to the final, frantic entries. Thorne had become a patient in his own archive, realizing his terrible mistake when the archive began to turn on him, using his own deepest secret fears against him. Thorne's final pages detailed the archive's mechanism for sustained energy collection. The sealed wing was constructed around a core made of a rare, naturally conductive black basalt stone. which acted as a permanent, non-expiring battery. The stone was located somewhere deep beneath the surgical theater. Thorne's ultimate solution, his desperate, failed attempt at self-preservation, was to break the sonic connection between the stone core and the surgical theater, the archive's primary transmission point. His plan was crude, involving the use of extreme, localized random noise, a massive, uncontrolled sonic explosion to destroy the precise, subtle geometry of the archival imprinting on the walls, effectively scrambling the pain library and neutralizing its focus. The archive, sensing its secrets were being exposed, began to retaliate with a full-spectrum assault. The air around Mark was suddenly thick with layers of simultaneous, conflicting pain. He felt the phantom pain of a severed limb on his right side, the debilitating nausea of a terminal illness in his gut, and the burning despair of deep, self-loathing, all hitting him in quick, agonizing succession. He stumbled back, colliding with the massive steel door, his body convulsing under the psychic trauma. He saw brief, terrifying visitations, a blurry, ghostly image of a man strapped to the operating table, screaming silently, his eyes fixed on Mark with impossible accusation, followed by the sight of a weeping woman, her skin covered in surgical stitching, dissolving instantly back into the mottled crimson of the wall. The walls were showing him their contents, desperate to overload his sensory system and claim his unique trauma for their growing collection. He knew he only had minutes before his mind either surrendered to madness or was shattered by the accumulated ancient agony. He was a photographer. He understood light, composition, and most importantly, vibration. He looked at his camera, his most expensive piece of equipment, and had a sudden, desperate idea. He remembered the extreme noise solution proposed by Dr. Thorne. He couldn't create an explosion, but he had something potentially more effective, a high-powered, shortwave radio transmitter and specialized lighting gear designed to generate controlled high-frequency sonic distortion during video shoots. His idea was simple. Use the equipment to create the most localized, violent, random acoustic pulse possible, directing the blast at the epicenter of the archive, the surgical table, to scramble the archive's psychic imprint, effectively getting the stored pain nowhere to transmit, sending the full, uncontainable energy back into the black basalt core where it would hopefully neutralize itself, moving on pure. Agonizing adrenaline, Mark rushed out of the observation room and into the vast, open surgical theater. The room was dark, but the air pulsed with a thick physical hatred that scraped against his skin. He set up his transmitter and a cluster of high-intensity, short-pulse strobe lights directly aimed at the scored steel surgical table. He had to work quickly, knowing the archive was now focusing its entire will on stopping him, its pressure tightening around his skull. As he calibrated the equipment, he felt the archive deliver its final, customized, and most crippling attack, the pain of failure and professional mediocrity, the quiet terror that his entire career of chasing ruin had been a waste, that his art was meaningless, that he was a shallow fraud. This pain, unlike the others, was his own, deeply buried, and it struck him with the force of a hammer, paralyzing him in the cold, crimson center of the terror archive. He lay on the cold, dark floor, weeping, his mind screaming that everything he had ever chased was worthless. The walls, emboldened by his surrender, began to glow a faint, deep crimson, and the surgical table started to vibrate with a low, hungry hum, ready to absorb his profound, self-inflicted pain. Then, through the haze of his despair, he heard the faint, metallic whisper of Dr. Thorne's recorded voice, played back by the archive itself. The failure is permanent. You are the final piece. The archive was mocking him, confirming his greatest fear. But that mockery, that simple act of externalizing his private fear, was the jolt of cold, detached anger he needed. Mark knew the pain was real, but the voice was just an echo. He found a sliver of strength, a last desperate act of defiance against the overwhelming weight of the archive's purpose. With a final, desperate surge of will, he reached out and slammed the activation button on his equipment. The surgical theater was instantly filled with a blinding, epileptic chaos of high-frequency strobe light and unbearable, ear-splitting screech of randomized, full-spectrum static noise. The violent, uncontrolled acoustic energy bombarded the surgically scored steel table, attacking the precise geometry of the archive's transmission grid. The crimson walls pulsed wildly, absorbing the sensory shock, but the sonic violence was too random, too chaotic, and too external to be contained by the orderly archive of wounded memory. The energy overloading the structure was immense, and the silence of the desert was annihilated by the terrifying, deafening blast that filled the forgotten surgical wing. Asterisk, the immediate impact of the sonic blast was not structural, but sensory, a pure, agonizing acoustic violence that felt like being physically disassembled from the inside out. The ear-splitting screech of randomized static, noise, and the epileptic chaos of the high-intensity strobes overloaded every single sensory input Mark possessed, temporarily overriding the psychic assault of the archive. The crimson walls, which moments before had pulsed with predatory sentience, began to vibrate uncontrollably, the precise geometric imprints of agony scrambling and dissolving under the chaotic, uncontrolled energy. Mark, lying paralyzed on the cold floor, his hands covering ears that were useless against the internal roar, watched in a disoriented haze as the very atmosphere of the surgical theater began to tear itself apart, the air shimmering and distorting as the contained psychic energy struggled to escape the structural failure. The archive was attempting to maintain its order, its malignant intelligence fighting the chaotic input, but the surgical table, the core transmission grid, was receiving a signal too dissonant, too random to catalog, absorb, or transmit, sending the full, uncontainable weight of decades of collected suffering slamming back into the structure itself. The retaliatory pressure from the archive was instantaneous and devastating, a last desperate attempt to reclaim control and silence the assault. The walls around Mark cracked and groaned, not with the sound of normal decay, but with a visceral, tearing sound, as if the pain stored within the material was physically trying to burst free, manifesting as visible fissures radiating outward from the precise centers of the sonic bombardment. The oppressive scent of stale blood and antiseptic grew impossibly thick, suffocating Mark, making his lungs burn with a sharp, chemical agony that was quickly overshadowed by the sudden, concentrated phantom pain in his left arm, a searing, localized blast of surgical trauma from a long-dead patient that brought a choked scream to his lips. He realized through the haze of agony that the archive was sacrificing localized memories, violently ejecting its contents wherever the structural integrity was weakest, desperately attempting to clear the signal and neutralize the sonic contamination. The fragments of physical pain, the memories of broken bones, deep incisions, and cauterized tissue were physically manifesting as localized sonic energy, creating pockets of unbearable, isolated sound that exploded and dissipated instantly, leaving behind a cold, chilling vapor that smelled faintly of ozone and decay. He managed to crawl behind an overturned metal cabinet, shielding his eyes from the blinding strobes, desperately counting the seconds. He knew the chaotic output couldn't last forever. The equipment would burn out, or the archive would find a way to absorb the input. He needed to destroy the black basalt core, the permanent battery that gave the archive its endless malignant life before the chaos subsided. He remembered Dr. Thorne's final scrawl. The core was deep beneath the surgical theater, accessible through a sealed access panel marked only by a minute. Surgical starburst symbol near the base of the central surgical table. He peered around the edge of the cabinet, spotting the table shimmering violently under the strobe light, its scored steel surface reflecting the chaotic energy. He spotted the tiny, faint starburst etching on the base of the table's pedestal, a final, macabre clue left by the archive's first victim, moving through the shattering storm of light and sound was a nightmare of physical and psychological disorientation. Every touch of his body against the floor sent a new, sharp jolt of foreign pain through him, the phantom pressure of a crushing surgical clamp on his fingers, the blinding sting of an unknown caustic agent in his eyes. He reached the table, the metallic stench of preserved agony overwhelming his senses. He fumbled frantically along the cold steel pedestal, his fingers searching for the almost invisible access panel, his mind battered by the full, unfiltered volume of the archive's resistance. The building was vibrating now with a deep, sickening resonance, the air filled with the desperate, overlapping sound of hundreds of silent screams finally being forced out of containment. The stone floor beneath his knees started to heat up, a sudden, intense thermal radiation emanating directly from the spot where the black basalt core resided. Signaling that the energy was being dangerously condensed, he found the access panel a cold, circular plate secured by 4 specialized surgical screws. He had nothing but a small, multi-purpose photography toolkit. He jammed the screwdriver into the first screw, his muscles screaming under the stress. The moment the screw turned, the core retaliated with extreme prejudice. A wave of psychic energy slammed into his back, paralyzing his legs and forcing his torso down onto the surgical table. His face was inches from the cold, scored steel, and in that agonizing instant, the archive transmitted its most devastating trauma yet, the full, vivid memory of the last surgery performed in that room, a long, agonizing procedure of purposeful, controlled pain, ending not in recovery, but in quiet, agonizing death, a memory of absolute hopelessness. The agony was not merely psychic. It felt physical, his own nerves replicating the suffering of the final patient, forcing him to experience the terrifying finality of abandonment and surgical betrayal. He screamed, a long, primal sound that was instantly absorbed by the frantic noise of the strobes. The pain was unbearable, but in the agony, Mark found a strange, detached clarity. The pain was not his. It was collected. It was an archive. And archives could be destroyed. He used the last flicker of his will, fueled by pure, unholy rage against the malignant intelligence that had trapped him, to wrench himself free from the table. He lunged back toward the pedestal, slamming the screwdriver into the remaining screws, his actions driven by blind, desperate purpose. The screws ground out of the metal, and the circular panel fell away with a clatter, revealing a deep, dark shaft leading down to the black, radiating basalt core below, which pulsed with a cold, malevolent light, the true, beating heart of the archive's enduring evil. Asterisk, the sudden exposure of the basalt core was a moment of terrifying finality. The chaotic sonic assault ceased instantly, the equipment finally burning out, plunging the surgical theater into a sudden, immense darkness and silence. The only light was the faint, cold, malevolent pulse emanating from the newly opened shaft, where the black basalt stone throbbed with the full, uncontainable energy of decades of collected agony. The silence was heavier than ever before, a vacuum of sound that pressed against Mark's eardrums, leaving him alone with the cold, absolute knowledge of the entity staring up at him from the heart of the structure. He knew he had minutes before the core found a way to bridge the gap and claim him entirely. Mark, now stripped of all hope and fear, fueled only by a grim determination to end the malignant architectural experiment, scrambled back to his camera bag. He ignored the debilitating phantom pain, focusing his analytical mind on the one thing that mattered, complete disruption. He grabbed his most powerful flash unit, a portable, high-voltage strobe designed for complex location shoots. He removed the Fresnel lens, exposing the raw, blinding flash tube, intending to deliver a massive, chaotic burst of unfiltered light energy directly onto the sensitive surface of the basalt. Light, the ultimate enemy of the archive's contained darkness, would be his final weapon against the stone core that preserved the nightmarish reality. He aimed the powerful flash unit directly into the exposed shaft. The basalt stone pulsed faster, the malevolent light intensifying, anticipating the new attack. Mark triggered the shutter. The flash was instantaneous, blinding, and overwhelming, a colossal, silent explosion of pure white light that filled the shaft and the surgical theater, momentarily erasing all shadows, revealing every crack and scar on the crimson walls with brutal clarity. The light was followed by a sound, not a crash, but a chilling, high-pitched whine, the collective sound of every contained trauma, being momentarily released and violently incinerated by the absolute photonic assault. The light lasted only a second, but its impact was catastrophic, an absolute dot when Mark's vision slowly recovered. The room was shrouded in a thick, metallic-smelling smoke, and the only light was the weak glow from the shattered access panel. The basalt core below was still visible, but its malevolent light was gone, replaced by a dull, fractured gray. The surface of the stone was cracked, fissured by the sudden, intense thermal and photonic shockwave. The archive was broken. The walls around him, the infamous crimson archives, were rapidly fading, the saturated color leaching out of the porous material, leaving behind the original antiseptic mint green beneath, the color of sterile institutional anonymity. The concentrated pain was gone, neutralized, dispersed into the structure as inert thermal energy. Mark fled the surgical wing, not in panic, but with the measured, urgent pace of a survivor who has just narrowly escaped a localized nuclear detonation. He sealed the heavy steel door behind him, not bothering to replace the melted padlocks. He stumbled out of the basement and into the blinding, familiar, healing sunlight of the Nevada desert, leaving the cold, decaying hospital behind him. He drove the aging 4x4 away without looking back, the relentless heat now a welcome, natural sensation against his ravaged, cold skin. The desert had witnessed the final, horrific surgery, the termination of Dr. Thorne's malignant masterpiece. He survived, the only living curator of the archive's terrifying legacy. Mark never photographed industrial decay again. The sight of a decaying structure brought back the sickening memory of the archive's true living contents. He sold his equipment and disappeared from the photography world, settling into a small, anonymous cabin in the mountains, seeking the quiet of nature, far from the complex, scarred architecture of man. The physical trauma faded, the phantom pain ceased, but the archive had taken its final toll. Mark was left with a permanent, chilling psychological transparency. He could no longer look at people, buildings, or even everyday objects without sensing their history of unresolved pain, trauma, and suffering, a dull, constant hum beneath the surface of reality. He saw the world as one vast, disorganized archive, its inhabitants all silently suffering from the unacknowledged scars of their past. Mark had not just documented the horror. He had become the final, unwilling vessel of Dr. Thorne's theory, the living curator of scars, capable of reading the agony imprinted on the world, forever denied the comfort of forgetting. He had defeated the building, but the archive's profound, crushing knowledge of human suffering had replaced his own mind, leaving him a silent, walking testament to the fact that some archives should never, ever be opened, and some scars can never truly be healed. He was a survivor who had traded his sanity for the world's ignorance, the last soul to know the terrible, secret truth of the archive of wounded memory.